Welcome to Managing Love Intelligently. My name is Jason.
And my name is Steve.
And what we do here is I present a topic to Steve, which I planned ahead of time, but Steve has no idea about, and we talk about it for an hour or so.
Just two guys having an awkward, uncomfortable conversation about sexuality.
Something I'm very uncomfortable about. But Steve's helping me work through it. Today's topic is divorce is the solution to a problem. I'll let Steve think about that for a second. And before we start the conversation, if you have a question for Steve, visit stevening.com and fill out the contact form. At the end of each episode, Steve will answer a listener question, so be sure to stay tuned for that. So for those who don't know, Steve has been divorced. So that's no news.
You said you'd never tell.
So I'd like to start with a personal question for Steve. Was your divorce a solution to a problem?
Yes. And, with a tear in one eye and deep regret and tremendous resistance, and after breaking through lots of denial and realizing there really wasn't another choice, it was the choice that really was adaptive, that made sense, that was liberating, I think, for not just me, but for my former spouse and even for my children, who were greatly affected by staying in a marriage, staying in a family that was characterized by the flaws that we had in our relationship. So yeah, it was. Although, and at that time, I was married as a young man, age 20, and stayed married for approximately 18 years. And at that time, the idea of getting married so that I could one day look forward to the possibility of getting divorced, it was unthinkable. Mm-hmm. I mean, I had assumed from the beginning we'd be together for the rest of our lives. And I brought a lot of irrational thinking to the relationship. I had a lot of what we now call thinking errors or cognitive distortions that made it impossible for me to give up, for me to admit failure, for me to see the handwriting on the wall, whatever metaphor we like to use. I just couldn't see how inherently flawed the relationship was in its foundation. Mm. I can go on in this vein. I mean, I'll drive everybody into suicide today listening to this.
But it's stuff that everyone needs to hear, because I've never been married, but I've been in, as I've told you and some listeners know who've listened to this podcast for quite some time, I've been in 3 relationships, and it seems like that's just it. You get in these relationships thinking they're going to last, and then something happens or things start accumulating, but you're so in it and you don't want to get out of it, and you stay and you continue to hope again and again and again that something is going to change, something's going to get better. And in a relationship like I am, you could break up and it's easier. But then if you're divorced, there's vows attached to that are from religion. So that's kind of like a sin if you get divorced. And
thanks, I'm feeling that.
Ouch,
that hurt. Yes.
But there's all these things that it's so hard to get out of. And I remember when I was a kid, my uncle got divorced when I was about maybe in 5th grade. And I remember my mom wasn't really that thrilled about it. Like I remember her making some comments about it.
Something disapproving
of his leaving his prior marriage and meeting this other person. But they seemed, from like an outsider's perspective, I was so young, but they seemed happy. But it like kind of ingrained something in me. It's like, okay, if you get married, you can't get divorced.
Right.
Because it was so disapproving and I didn't really fully understand it.
Yeah. And I've had countless clients. I can't even tell you how many clients I've worked with who have had exactly the same thoughts, as did I, because I was religious at that time in my life. And I had this deeply ingrained belief that divorce was a sin. It was not a thinkable alternative. And it made it very difficult for me, along with my character defects and my irrational beliefs. It was just really hard to get past all of that. It was really a taboo. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about it, I think not that this was my plan today, but you're the one who introduced it. But what does this have to do with sexuality? Well, it has to do with mate selection, which is part of our sexuality, has to do with the nature of a committed monogamous relationship, which is, again, about our sexuality, and epic failure, which is another thing about our sexuality. Mm-hmm. So it's sex, 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 all the way through this. And what's weird about it, I think, there's so many weird things about divorce, but one of the weird things about the experience was realizing that we live in a culture that pays lip service to the family being the foundation or the bedrock of our civilization. But at the same time, nobody gets any instruction on how to have a successful, intimate relationship. And I know that is because teachers and educators across the country really don't have any knowledge themselves about what it would take to have a successful relationship. And I don't blame them. It's just kind of, I don't know. I don't know if ironic is the right word, but I wince a little bit at the thought of all the classes I've seen others take or taken myself in things like bookkeeping, driver's ed, home ec, and what I really would have liked to have known is how to put together a normal family.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have had a class called Relationship 101 back in high school. And to have it be a year long, I think would have been appropriate because it's a complicated bit of business, especially for those of us who come from less than perfect families and have, so much to work through before we even get to zero. We have all the negative numbers before we get to zero on the number line. And then getting up into the positive numbers is a bit of a struggle there as well. So yeah, the fact that it's taboo, that it's wrong, you shouldn't do it, that turns the whole notion into a bit of a sin. It's something unthinkable. But when you think about it, there's so many relationships that violate all of the implied warranties that getting a divorce is the answer. It's the thing that makes sense. And it's a very humble admission that, oops, I made a mistake. I got together with the wrong person. I thought I was with the right person. I thought I was doing this right. I thought I had performed my due diligence. I thought we had God's upturned thumb saying, yeah, go for it. But it turned out all of that was in error.
Yeah. And I can imagine that being quite difficult for anybody to go through. So it's like,
oh my God.
I mean, it's like our hearts go out for the people. Like I've had most of my friends who got married in their 20s are now divorced.
Yeah. I appreciate your saying that because I do think many people are kinder than I am and more thoughtful. And I suspect you're one of them. But because, honestly, I just remember people telling me they'd gone through a divorce or they were in the middle of a divorce. And whether
you were like, yes, congratulations.
No. Whether I was their friend or just an acquaintance, I remember paying lip service to the notion of sympathy. Oh, that's too bad. I'm sorry to hear that. But I wasn't really feeling it. I was expressing sympathy verbally without feeling any empathy. But I'll tell you, going through a divorce and having that very painful experience under my belt, nowadays, when somebody tells me they're going through a divorce, it just rocks me and I stop in my tracks and I am so sorry to hear that. Yeah. How are you holding up? I really want to reach out to that person. And I think that's the benefit of suffering. Suffering carves out a little space in our hearts to realize people just like us out there are really feeling horrible, yet still getting up and going to work and making breakfast for their kids and doing all the things they're supposed to do in the midst of such terrific pain.
Yeah. But you didn't have at 20 years old, you didn't really have a significant relationship prior to the marriage, did you? And the part where you've had your heart broken or anything like that? Like most people, I feel like don't get divorced or don't get married that early.
Well, not nowadays, because nowadays the average age of first marriages for men, at least, is really about 30.
Oh yeah, so yeah, back then,
back then, it was I was like an old maid.
Yeah,
man, No, it wasn't quite that bad. I got married somewhat early, but nobody blinked an eye except for my mom. My mom, I remember, whatever her flaws might have been, she loved me very much. And she said, "Oh, you're just too young." Unfortunately, not only was I hard of hearing and in terms of spiritually speaking, I knew that just didn't make any sense on the surface, because there was no reason why a chronological age or birth date on a calendar should by itself mean something. But in hindsight, if she could have explained, no, you need so much more life experience and there's so many things you don't understand. Let me teach you. Unfortunately, she wasn't prepared to teach me because she herself was still learning that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Or if she said, "Have you done your intentional interview?
Oh my gosh.
Have you have you asked these questions about this person? Have you talked about sex? Can you talk about sex?"
No. There was nothing like that. And there was no logic, reason, science. There's nothing like that associated with any of it. And it was typical then of most men. I mean, my reasoning was, she was pretty. I found her very attractive. And number two, she was willing to be seen with me in public. So what more does a guy need? It was ordained from the Lord. And so we tried and we tried and we tried and we tried. But, one of the things that's implied, and I think in a relationship, is that a relationship like that, I should say, is that in any partnership, that when you get home, like in baseball, getting to home plate, you'll be safe. And we never established that whole notion of safety. So one of the things, looking in hindsight, after it was all over with, I realized, we never figured out how to have an abuse-free relationship. And it wasn't just, it wasn't knockdown, drag them out, people ending up in the hospital or anything like that. But it was abusive. And, I'd rather not say who initiated. I don't think it's a matter of whose fault it was to do whatever. But when it occurs, it's so shocking for the other person. And then very quickly, if you don't have a body of knowledge or frame of reference that says, hey, that's abuse, and you can never, ever have a good relationship until, first of all, you have a safe relationship. That thought wasn't even in my mind. And so very quickly, abuse became normalized, and then it became, the abusive behavior became an object of pity. Oh, poor thing. They just need more love. They need more patience. They need more something. And until I got to the point where it was really obvious that it was never going to change, that I just kept living kind of like an anorexic visiting a spa, living from one spa meal to the next, like 3 strawberries and a glass of mineral water.
It's my favorite.
Yeah, right. Meal after meal. And I would live for these mountaintop experiences where, all right, now we've got a breakthrough. We've really figured this out. Now we're going to have a great relationship and a great life. This is going to make a great book someday. And
you thought that again and again and again.
Oh yeah, once every approximately 3 to 9 months, there'd be an experience like that. And then very shortly after that, it would be like even like the next day, it would be back to business as usual. But I kept hoping, and we both hung in there, and until finally one day I realized, hey, I'm really starting to hate the man that I'm becoming. I did not like this guy.
What weren't you liking about it?
You know what? I think it's the direct. What was happening in me was that I was living in a relationship with all of the obligations of monogamy with none of the benefits. So, like everybody else in that situation, I started coping with dysfunctional choices. And sometimes those choices were just my reverting back to my early childhood behavior of being controlling, sometimes perfectionistic, and as much with me as with anyone else. And always workaholism. That was always a go-to. And I think between my acquaintances, friends, family, my children, I think people would all have been shy about confronting me, but I think they all would have agreed if I hadn't been in the room. Yes, does Steve strike you as a little bit controlling? I think there would have been an outburst of laughter, and everyone was, "Well, you think?" Yeah. So that was the worst of it. It wasn't like drinking, gambling, or drugs, or compulsive shopping, or any of the many other things. But believe me, it was ugly enough. It was kind of weird too, because the stuff I chose were the same things my mother-in-law would, commend me for. Oh, you're such a hard worker. You're you're a good earner. You're so diligent, responsible. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's the good side of it. Except the dark side of, being compulsive about it is you're really not emotionally available.
Yeah.
So I'm turning into that guy, and I could see the handwriting on the wall. It wasn't like I was a prophet or something, but I could see, hey, one of these days, pretty soon, I'm going to be a middle-aged guy with my shirt unbuttoned to my navel and wearing gold chains, driving a convertible around, and I just cringed at that image of myself. I really aspired to have a meaningful connection with a life partner. And boy, did I miss. Did I miss the mark on that one?
And how were you feeling with the religious sense of it all? Like, were you struggling with that as far as, because I'm sure I would imagine, I don't know if it's true, but if I were religious, I wouldn't want to break that sin in fear of going to hell.
Well, I didn't really think that God would send me to hell. That wasn't the for me, as you can imagine, okay. As a self-admitted perfectionist and very critical person, it was more the idea of failing, and failing at something that was significant. So it wasn't like I tripped over something that was in my path. It was like I really had failed. I mean, to the point where I was a failure. And it caused me to really look at faith and everything else, because according to the rule book, for me, the Holy Scriptures, I pretty much followed all the rules. I'd set up, it was like a child carefully setting up a board game, making sure all the pieces are in the right place before the gameplay starts. And I thought I had done all of that, and I was feeling pretty good about that. And, and I was commending myself for all the things I wasn't. And I remember, even thinking about my mom and dad, well, okay, I don't drink, and I'm not a criminal, and I don't do this, and I don't do that. And it wasn't, it really, I think part of the experience was my realizing that the Scriptures are actually not a helpful how to do it manual.
Yeah, don't follow the Bible for your relationship advice.
Oh my gosh. And there were so many like Bible-oriented books and church-oriented literature and all of that I was reading. And it just, none of it was very helpful. None of it really was helpful at all. A lot of it was well meant. And some of it was beautifully written, very touching in some ways, but mostly overall contributing to a sense, no, this is doable. You can do this. But you just have to do it right.
Okay. So it was like, that's what the message you were getting. And then you were thinking like, I can't even do this anymore. So that was causing you maybe to feel that failure even more.
Yeah. What I think the pros listening to this would call cognitive dissonance. My behavior and my values weren't really lining up. And but again, I think in hindsight, I would say people who are using the Bible to try to solve technical issues in relationships are only guilty of making a mistake, like going to the hardware store to buy their groceries.
Yeah.
It's kind of it's just the wrong place. There was a time, many centuries ago, where the Bible was considered the ultimate science book, and it had all truth and only truth, and it was right about everything it pronounced on. And then along comes the Enlightenment, and then Darwin, Charles, come on, and there was this sort of a amicable divorce, and in terms of the division of property, the church insisted that it keep the domain of the human soul and human relationships. And the church has always arm wrestled with psychology over that. And there have been various, returns to the courtroom between psychology and religion to see who gets to do what now. And I think for me, though, this is a big one. So I am now approaching my 70th birthday. And it's only in the last couple of years that I have completely given up on any belief in God. And the reason really goes all the way back to that divorce. And it has to do with, if there was a God who did create us and he was all knowing, it sure seems odd that he doesn't know more about human sexuality and human relationships than he does. And that he's kind of a hard ass about that stuff, as portrayed in the church. Yeah. And he will judge the unrighteous and he will punish them. And I'm contrasting that with, the God of love we've all heard about from other churches. And really I'm not that special, and I know that, but I was far more loving with my clients than the God they were worshiping was with them. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm not exactly wonderful, right? And they said, well, yeah, we know you. I said, okay, but you could slow your roll on that a little bit. And I don't judge you for your failure. I mean, I think it's really understandable that you failed. You didn't know what you were doing. And doesn't it seem like God would be at least as understanding as Stephen Ing? Mm-hmm. And if he was a loving, caring God. And they look at me suspiciously because they know where that's going. Yeah. And it just doesn't feel right. And usually I would get some non-committal answer like, I guess. But for me, it just seems like proof positive there really can't be a God and it makes sense if you think about the scriptures, the Christian scriptures and the Jewish scriptures being somewhere between 2,000 and say, let's just say, be generous, say between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. Well, yeah, I don't think sheep herders and warriors and all the rest of the people alive then really did know anything about relationships. I mean, average lifespan, maybe if you were lucky, getting to 40, and life was a lot more brutal.
Yeah, it's more about survival than.
Yeah, it wasn't about being happy. And I never saw scripture about being happy in your marriage. And, and what do you do when you're totally mismatched and that sort of thing? Do you just live with it? Oh, okay, well, I guess a promise is a promise. I've had clients say that to me as well. And in fact,
about marriage.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Like one guy, his family wasn't even that religious, but they were influenced by their Lutheran background. And I did a podcast on this guy called, oh gosh, I can't remember now what it's called, but his wife came up to him. He's long gone now. He's deceased, by the way. And his wife came up to him and said, I don't want to ever have sex with you anymore. Mm-hmm. Now, they'd already had 2 children. They'd been married 7 years. And he just looked at her like bewildered. And I'm pretty sure this was in the late 40s. And he said, okay. And he just didn't know what else to do.
Yeah.
And of course he stayed married. And I say married. And I say, of course, because that was his family's expectation, like your mother, kind of like your mother.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, but he began, and to just top it off, his wife spent the rest of her entire life in a bottle drinking. So he began a sex life of just flying solo, masturbating, in the bathroom on the floor and just trying to.
On the floor? Is that like the.
Yeah, because eventually he found some porn and he'd be looking at porn and trying to, get some sort of sexual gratification, but completely missing all the questions about love, intimacy, connectedness, and all of that. Because at least he was doing the right thing. He wasn't getting a divorce.
Yeah.
So you can see,
right thing. And is that tying back into the managing sexuality intelligently, like at that point in your marriage, are you doing that? Probably
Oh,
not.
yeah,
Like him.
no, if you're like him,
Yeah.
no, by no means are you doing anything sane or rational. And even a lot of clergy would agree at that point that, there was something not worth hanging out for. But there are many clergy who would say, no, just like he did, promise is a promise. You made a commitment.
That's what the religious would say?
Well, there'd be both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's some that do accept it if it's like an extreme case like that?
Yeah. My understanding of Greek Orthodoxy or Eastern Orthodoxy would be if sex is being denied, that in itself is grounds for divorce.
Oh, okay.
So, but there are others who would say, no, that's the desire of the flesh, and you've got to resist the devil so he will flee from you. And you got to, cling to the Lord, brother.
Yeah.
Just cling to the Lord. So it's very inhumane in that way. It's like the old Greek myth of Procrustes. I think we've talked about that on this podcast.
Yes, with his bed.
Yeah, that iron bed that was rigid and unyielding, and everyone was forced to sleep in his bed at least one night. If you were too tall, that is, he'd have your legs cut off so you could fit the bed. And if you were too short to fit the bed, then he would throw you on the rack and stretch you out till you'd fit the bed that way. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot like, I think, what religion asks of humanity in terms of sexuality. We all have to be the same.
Yeah.
We all got to fit the same bed, which is in itself a metaphor for sexuality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. I wanted to, what about the idea, going back to God really quick, like you're saying, what about God as, like, why does God have to be pigeonholed into that older realm? Like, can't God be humans coming up with newer ideas that allow them to evolve into higher thinking people? Like, so saying, like, not saying you're a god, but like you are allowing a higher sort of thoughts to flow through you, so you're doing God's will by expressing the doctrine of managing sexuality intelligently. And there's other people, doctors, doing that. It's like we're all kind of God filtering through the highest stuff we could do to live the best lives we live.
You are so close to hell and you don't even know it. Oh my God. So why can't God be cool? Is that the question?
No, why can't we be always redefining what God is? Like, why is it? It's
I'm going to choke on that and die right here in front of you. That's because there's an objective truth. It's in the word, and God is who he is. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He never changes.
Oh, really?
That's a quote. I mean,
that right there shows you that it's not real. I would have closed the book after that.
Okay, I'm moving away from you in case the lightning bolt gets too close. But no, I really don't have any faith myself, anymore, and trust in that kind of a God. Instead, it makes more sense to me. I had somebody come up to me just last week saying that he didn't believe either, but he really thought that the Bible was the best codification of human morality that had ever existed. And it was the basis for all Western civilization. And I looked at him, and it was, kind of a thoughtful comment, and I really wanted to absorb it. And I tried to be respectful and gentle when I suggested, I don't think that's it. I think it's your humanity that has been the basis for human morality, that we as a species evolved to be a social species, that part of being a social species is we develop the capacity for altruism. We care about one another, and and that is the basis for all morality, is really caring for other human beings as if they have the same feelings that you and I have, and not doing to other people what we wouldn't have done to ourselves. So he looked at me, of course, it's like so many of my clients, like I'm crazy. And maybe he'll think about it. Maybe he won't. But it's funny that, to me, Christianity is only 2,000 years old. Judaism is, I think, just a little bit older than that. But the human race is, I think, arguably about 100,000 years old. And we are the ones who invented religion. So
yeah, that's what I'm saying with my whole God thing. It's like we invented it, but it's like the inventors back then were the sheep herders, and it's like it's evolved. But they said in there that God can evolve, so I guess that's where the hiccup's coming.
Well, yeah, and that's where the idea of orthodoxy comes from. You don't question the rules because the rules are unchanging, because God is unchanging. And that's why masturbation will always be wrong. And we're all waiting for you to just stop it, Jason. And that's why being gay is always wrong, and trans, don't even get me started. And any kind of sex outside of marriage, whether it's premarital or extramarital, that's just evil. It's just so very wrong. And we haven't even gotten to talk about sex with Moabites and stalactites and all the other ites out there. So, including the dead. So there are a lot of rules about sex, as there are in Judaism about food and what's kosher and what's not. But most of us would argue, yeah, I don't really think any of that really matters now. It's no longer relevant. And it's specifically not relevant in terms of the growing body of knowledge about who we really are as a species, and the amount of sexual diversity. You know, you could have two men of the same age raised in the same part of the United States, and they're both heterosexual, but that's where the similarities may end in terms of their sexuality, because they can be so diverse in terms of who they are, what they need, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. And the listeners, you know, are going to have to take my word for it, because I talk about sexuality for a living, that we are all so very different. And when I say all, I mean all of us are very different one from another. Just like our faces are different from one another, and we can tell, oh, it's Steve and not Jason, or Jason and not Steve. When we talk about sexuality, when we really talk about it, when we really get to know somebody, there are people who are physically attractive from whom we would all run screaming from the room rather than spend a night with those people. And there are other people who would run screaming into that room trying to get at them because they're so great and so wonderful. Yeah. And so to have this idea that there's some sort of Procrustean bed that we all have to fit and we all have to be the same, it's just absolutely untenable. And it's the opposite of what we would call adaptive, you know, experiencing the universe and seeing what it is and being open to new solutions for what? Oh yeah, new problems. So I think divorce is just the humble admission, oops, I thought I was on the right track and I made a mistake.
Yeah. Do you look at it more as a failure still, or do you look at it as a lesson from the universe?
Well, like so many questions like that, it's, you know, it doesn't have to be either or, it can be both and. And I do think it was an epic fail, because it sure wasn't what I was trying to achieve. But I do think it was also a lesson from, or let's say a semester's worth of life lessons at the graduate level on what I was doing wrong, what I needed to learn to do better, and what I have learned to do better. And I think that's why really where the impetus for this podcast comes from is, once you've experienced real happiness in a relationship and having known unhappiness, you don't want anybody to go through what you went through to get there. I don't want to see any of the people listening to have to go through even one more day or one more experience unnecessarily, when they could learn from somebody who was just kind enough to share, you know, about their own epic failure.
Yeah. And you don't have to, like some people think you have to go through that pain to get there. And I've heard other people talk about on podcasts or wherever I heard it. I mean, there's so many people talking nowadays, but the idea that you don't have to go through your own pain, that you can get a little bit of guidance, and you can also have a transformation by having the right information in front of you and putting it into practice that way.
Yeah. I do think being a human being is somewhat complicated. And I do think relationships are even more complicated, because now we're trying to figure out how two people can live together happily. But it's not so complicated we can't understand it. And yet we spend a fair amount of time teaching nutrition to our children and even to adults. And that's even much, much simpler than the things you and I are talking about. But we don't let our children just okay, see you later. Go find something to eat. It's a big world out there. Try some of those shrubs out in front of the house. We actually caution our children about poisons. We pay attention to their allergies. We find what works for them, what doesn't work for them. And we don't turn it into a moral thing like, well, you just got to toughen up. Those strawberries never made me have hives. That peanut butter never closed up my throat.
Yeah.
Just eat it. And we accept that because we can see, the kid who was forced to eat nuts when he has a nut allergy and he dies tragically. I mean, that's heartrending. It's so very painful to even think of that happening out of ignorance, especially, or carelessness. But the same things are true in a parallel way of human relationships. For going back to my failed marriage, there is virtually no one in this country who is teaching you have to have a safe relationship before you can have a good relationship. And that's such a no-brainer. It's so freaking easy to see the logic in that, but nobody's actually teaching that, and nobody's defining what do you mean by safe. And for me,
what do you mean by good?
Yeah, what do you mean by good? We don't even talk about that, and yet it's intuitively obvious, nevertheless. So, for me, I just think that human religion and belief systems are ideally supposed to serve humanity. They're supposed to guide us and codify different rules that would actually be helpful. And instead, religion and other belief systems like different cult groups, looking at you, I'm all you cultists out there. I was thinking of Tom Cruise.
What's that, Scientology?
Yeah, I was thinking of all the rules out there and all the strange things that people buy into. But if the rules are more important than I am, it's an anti-human belief system. And it's not there to serve humanity. It's there to control humanity.
Yeah.
And so we all need to keep looking. Now, myself, I've really, jumped ship, gone native, and I read the Tao every day, and it's just it's very spiritual, but it's just vague enough that I never feel controlled. I never see any commandments there telling me I got to do it this way, I got to do it that way. And mostly, if there's any admonition at all, I think running through it, it's the admission to seek what is natural, which, I mean, natural within my own heart, natural within the universe. And that seems like a pretty good idea, to go with nature rather than fighting against nature.
Yeah. And
it's a bit of wisdom that I don't think I ever got from any other religion. So, and I don't consider Taoism a religion. I know some people do, but for hundreds of years, it was not a religion until somebody decided they really needed to mess it up. And build temples and start a priesthood and all of that. I think it's just there in a way to, like what I was saying before, it's there to serve humanity.
Do you feel like then you are a spiritual person? Like, how do you define yourself?
Oh, you know what? I know a lot of us who've been bruised by religion or even by, let's call it, spiritual abuse. And there's been horrific levels of spiritual abuse out there. I think those of us who've gone through those things kind of hang our head and think, well, I'm not spiritual anymore, unless maybe they end up at an AA meeting and then they feel like they can claim that because it's a spiritual program. But I think spirituality is a lot like the human capacity for altruism or for aesthetic appreciation, loving beauty. It's just part of who we are.
Yeah. Because
spirituality deals with the unseen dimension of life, having to do with what is the meaning of life, the purpose, why am I here, for example, and also morals and values, like how should I live? What should I do in this circumstance or that circumstance? And I think that all of us have an endowment from our ancestors genetically to be spiritual beings. This matters to us. We care about this. We are more than just some sort of unthinking brute animal who just lives to feed from a stall in a stable. We are actually caring about this stuff. And I think that the spirituality, it's pretty clear from reading Charles Darwin and some of the other really great writers who have come around in the last 10, 20, 30 years, that, we evolved the capacity for this kind of thinking because it really serves us as a species. It helps us to figure out how to live together peacefully. Mm-hmm. And giving some thought to that really helps erase some of the crazy tribalism. Well, we're going to heaven, but those people are going to hell because they worship a different God. Mm-hmm. And the craziness we're all watching as, Israel fights Palestinians in Gaza. There's so much hatred between the two peoples, and it's mostly based on religion. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that that's not really serving humanity anymore. I think we can do better. I think we deserve an upgrade.
So what do you think you're here for on this planet?
Wow. Do I even, people know my age because I'm pretty open about that, but it's taken me up into my 60s or my late 50s for sure, I think, to figure out why I was here. I always wondered about that question. And I really think for me particularly, because of my privileged position helping other people with their sexuality and having learned so much, not only about how to help them, but how to help myself, how to understand myself, and how I went wrong, in my own journey. I just really want to share those things with the whole planet. I think if the three of us listening to this podcast right now, whoever's out there, if we could just carry this message to America in particular, there's such a center of gravity in this country that it would really spread throughout the world. And when I say this message, I mean to understand human sexuality compassionately and as not a source of great temptation and evil, but as something that's really part of the most beautiful and best part of ourselves. And it's simply crying out for the same kind of intelligent management that every other part of our life is calling out for. Mm. I think that's my purpose.
Nice. And you're, so going back to the divorce too, like to go back to that, you're a therapist who isn't afraid to tell people that divorce is okay.
No, I had, as usually about once a week, I'll have a couple, in my office for the first time.
Once a week? And you're like, nah.
No, I got a lot of...
Divorce, next.
You guys are toast. Yeah. Give it up. Come on. No, explaining to people who I think really need to hear that explanation that I'm a marriage and family therapist. I really believe in marriage. I love my own marriage, but I also have had the experience of what it means to be in a very unfulfilling marriage and how that can negatively affect people and drive them to do things that are really against their better judgment, to where they stop liking themselves. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, life is pretty darn short. So the idea that people should stay would be to incorporate some sort of a message that your marriage is this third client of mine. There's him, there's her, and then there's the marriage. And this marriage, we've got to save the marriage. It's like that baby in Raising Arizona, the one that gets dropped onto the middle of the freeway or the highway, and the vehicles are, passing it by. And it's, to me, the marriage is not a person. It's not a baby that needs to be saved. The marriage is a construct representing what the two of us have built. And quite often what the two of us have built is rather deformed and ugly and really needing, a wooden stake through its heart, because it's just awful.
And is that because they just don't have the tools and that they're not even aware of even the safe relationship, good relationship? Like,
well, this is where I retreat back into, some of my profession, because it's complicated. Sometimes it's because maybe one of them has the tools and one of them is really ready to go, but they didn't do an intentional interview, and they ended up with somebody with a very serious personality disorder.
Yeah.
And that person is incapable of love, both giving it and receiving it. And so long as they are the way they are, that is not going to happen. I mean, there's no way they're going to have a great marriage come out of that.
Yeah.
So there are times where, divorce is really just the only rational alternative, like the marriage where one of them is physically beating the others, or the others meaning children in the family as well. I've had so many clients who come to me with marital problems or other mental health problems like anxiety or depression. And I haven't met anybody yet who doesn't have a history of early childhood trauma, including the people who deny they have a history of early childhood trauma. Because, let's face it, we were babies and then toddlers and then really young, vulnerable children. And who among us had perfect parents or perfect situations at school every day, or perfect lives, when our parents went on vacation without us and we were left with somebody else? We have all had bad experiences. And these bad experiences with our little children's brains affected us the way that you would expect it would affect a child. The child is stunned, confused, and then develops some really childish explanations of how to handle this or what to do to cope with it. And then for the rest of their lives, it seems, until they get some help, every time they encounter those same exact emotions, whether it's sadness or fear or anger, whatever it is, they react with the same kinds of self-soothing behaviors, like becoming controlling, smoking another cigarette or something else that's a little more serious, or gambling or overeating or whatever it is. We all have compulsive behaviors that we developed as a result simply out of never getting the help we needed. So we helped ourselves.
Yeah.
And not surprisingly, we didn't do that great of a job at it. I used to always beat myself up for being so abusive with my little brother, until one day, after years of feeling guilty, decades of feeling guilty, I realized, oh my gosh, I was only like 4 or 5 when he was left alone with me. Of course, I wasn't a good caregiver. I was totally incompetent at that. And I felt this great sigh of relief fill me, and I realized I could forgive myself for what I had assumed was a moral question, when it was really just neglect of me as a child putting me in that situation. And understandably, my mom was a single mom. She had to go to work. I understand why she couldn't do different than what she did.
Yeah.
But it's nevertheless had an effect on me, and that effect trickled down to my brother, and so on. And it's the same way with all of us. We all have been put in situations where we did the best we could with our limited knowledge. And then the really stubborn among us, who are very rigid, and I look in the mirror when I say that, we get defensive when that whole format gets challenged or questioned in any way. When actually, there aren't any of us children who came up with superb coping strategies. They were coping strategies enough to keep us alive, apparently, till we got older, but they weren't really adaptive. They were quite maladaptive, or at least maladaptive as we got older. They might have worked while we were really young. Beating up my little brother all the time and yelling at him really served me in the sense that my life felt out of control, and doing those horrible things to him really gave me a sense of control in my life. But imagine if I'd kept that into my adult life, and applied that to every problem I was in. That would have been horrible. So we all need to have a real serious conference with ourselves, sit down, have a good think, take a look at those things. But that's what I see when I look at our marriages. Like, why would marriage? We all made mistakes on our arithmetic homework. We all made mistakes on everything else we've ever done from mowing the lawn properly to doing anything in our lives. And we're going to have a belief system centered on the idea that, nope, your marriage was perfect. Nothing to change here. We'll never need to revisit this. On your way, sir.
What are some of the things that you tell couples who are struggling? I mean, some commonalities, I guess, I know there's probably differences.
Oh, yeah. I mean, again, as different as we all are, every marriage is different. And yet, I think an experienced therapist sees a lot of commonalities. Like, there are many ways to have an unsafe relationship, right? It could be unsafe just because of verbal abuse. It could be unsafe because there's physical abuse. Mm-hmm. It could be unsafe because there are all these guilt trips and spiritual abuse, or all of the above, or let's just add some alcohol to that.
Yeah, I would imagine the verbal abuse and stuff like that is common, just from witnessing relationships.
Oh, it's very common
because it happens so often.
Oh, yeah.
And some people do it as like a joke or something like that, but it's like, that joke's a little on the edge of...
And then if you say anything about it, it's like, can't you even take a joke? And so there's another little put down. What's wrong with you? And they start gaslighting you. So, yeah, I think, first of all, just to ask yourself, is this even safe? Does this feel safe? Do I feel safe in this relationship? And then the second question, diagnostically, is, perhaps I know that my mate loves me, cognitively speaking, but when was the last time I really felt loved? Mm. And I think those two questions, if you have answers you don't like, I think those two questions point to the need to kind of reevaluate and have some talks and see what's going on. And if a couple can solve their problems on their own just through talking, that'd be awesome. I don't think everybody needs to go to a therapist, but if a couple can't solve problems, that's also another indicator. The inability to problem solve as a team, then it's time to go get some help.
And you recommend that after like 30 days or something, you say, like, a problem?
Well, if you've been unhappy for a significant period of time, but you're just now coming out of your denial, why would anybody need to wait for more than 30 days?
Yeah.
We're bringing it up. If it's an easy problem to solve, like a crooked piece of art on the wall, and we could just adjust it. And if we need to get the level out, maybe put in another nail in the wall to hang it better. If it's a simple problem, then yeah, we don't need to come to a therapist. But even some really simple problems are incredibly difficult to change. What if the simple problem is your partner just uses too much cocaine?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a simple problem. Just stop. Why can't you just stop? Well, there are reasons why people can't just stop.
And that's probably childhood trauma.
Yeah, it almost always is. But so is not being able to walk away almost always related to childhood trauma.
Oh, really? So for the other person, they're dealing with that.
Absolutely. We're all doing it. And I think for people who can face those things, can face the failures, there's a potential to solve the problem. And there's also a potential to admit failure and to move on. And at the very least, have a great life, whether you're single or you meet somebody else, and are able to establish a more fulfilling relationship.
Have you ever had where the couple comes in, you're helping them, and they both come to this epiphany that it's just beyond repair and that they can both have a better life if they were divorced and they kind of amicably split? Have you ever had?
Well, you make it sound so benign and pleasant, but
after a lot of pain and tears and.
Well, I've had two people really, I've had the experience of having two people who really are trying, and one of them remains absolutely clear, this just isn't working for me. Mm-hmm. And the other person throws their hands up in the air and said, fine, then I'm done. I'm not trying anymore. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that even though it's not the outcome that they might have ideally preferred, I think they have a shot at much more happiness in the future.
Yeah. And that's what it's about. It's about the whole point of this podcast is a solution to a problem. And it's like you're kind of stuck in something that's not working, and you should be living a life that is satisfying, that's safe, that's all these things. And divorce or marriage shouldn't lock us in so tightly that we can't get out of that.
Yeah, I'm going to throw out a question too that I think I've mentioned before, but for those couples who are really just kind of locked in a maladaptive, rigid situation and they just don't seem to be able to get out of it, I always pose the question, well, if one of your adult children were to find themselves in a marriage just like yours, would you advise them to stay? And you know what's funny? I've never had a parent say yes to that. If they're in a miserable relationship and resistant to doing anything about it, resistant to change, resistant to moving on, you can just kind of watch them, their shoulders slump, they relax, and they go, no, I would never tell my son, I would never tell my daughter to just stay.
Yeah.
And that's a very important thing, because that's the real love in their life. They really love their children, and they really don't want their children's lives to be like mom and dad's. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And the contrast is with the lack of love they have for themselves, the lack of care, the lack of regard, the lack of perspective that allows them to see things just as clearly when it comes to their own life.
Yeah.
And I think that's something a therapist can be very helpful, for the sake of facilitating that sort of clarity, getting past some of that, the belief systems that say, no, that's you signed up for this, and this is what you get. You agreed, and you knew going in that it was going to be hard. And I know I keep droning on and on, but this business of, I think I'll scream the next time somebody. Okay, I won't scream. I'm a man. I'll roar. Okay. The next time somebody says, well, marriage is hard. You've got to really work at it.
Yeah.
No, it's really not. It's really not hard. We're a social species, and we're actually pretty good at this. What is hard is recovering from early childhood trauma. It's really hard to be ready to be married. To be a mature person who's capable of emotional intimacy and sharing what it is that you're feeling, and sexual intimacy where you can share your histories and really get to know each other. And I don't mean all on the first date, of course. I mean over time. But if people could understand that they really need to get ready before they get in a relationship, I think that would make a huge difference. So the focus would be on developing a life worth living, a life you really enjoy, and then you get to evaluate any potential candidates for how that would work with them in your life. Because for a lot of us, bringing the person we're dating into that situation would only cause the quality of our life to go significantly downward. Whereas there are others who would really enhance our lives and make our lives as wonderful as they are. Our lives are, they would make our lives even more wonderful with them in it.
Yeah. And that's what's so cool about that whole thing about creating a life worth living. Like even that simple advice that
so simple
you don't get until many, many years later. And then you do then create that life, and you're not as needy. You're not as ready to jump into something because you're like, whoa, I have something like really good here, and I'm liking how I'm living, and what I'm doing recreationally for work, etc. And you really have to then have somebody who's really going to step it up a notch to go into that.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah. And then one more thing with divorce, another thing that I think is interesting, you say if people do, and then we'll end on this. So if people do go to counseling for it and they do decide to pursue it, there almost has to be a death of that first marriage in order to move on. Is that?
That sounds like you're quoting me. Yeah, I do think that whatever was going on in the first failed version of the marriage, let's say marriage 1.0, there's something that really needs to be burned up, and then like the phoenix rise from his own ashes. So, I think that I remember one time when I asked my then wife, I said, I just don't think you really love me. Well, I love you. And I said, well, I'm not even sure you like me. Well, of course I like you. Can you name 3 things you like about me? And silence. There's this long silence. And I said, yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I don't see how you can love me if you don't even like me. And for some of us, there is a wonderful opportunity to get to know this person we never really got to know. And we learn to like them because we're capable of love. And it works both ways. And the two of us come together in a way we never dreamed of. I've seen that happen with so many epic failures, where people have, one of them has an affair, and there's so much hurt and so much travail. How do we get past this? Well, really, the marriage 2.0 is so much better than 1.0 that it's not a matter of, well, let's return to what we had, the marriage that led to the affair. No. We can do much better than that. So I see a lot of happy people out there after, that dark cloud of whatever hurtful experience comes into their life. They find, oh, there's this silver lining that's just absolutely wonderful. And I had no idea marriage could be this good.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you all for that. And to wrap things up, we have a listener question. And again, if you have a question for Steve, visit stevening.com and fill out the contact form. So this week's question reads as follows. Hi, Steve. I read your Psychology Today article titled Never Date a Guy Who Doesn't Have Friends. I read it because my husband doesn't have friends and he's perfectly fine with being a homebody. I can see now that he's definitely on the spectrum, which I didn't know when we got married. I just thought he was an introvert like me. Would you say being on the spectrum is an exception to the rule, or should he be encouraged to make friends? What is your advice?
What an interesting question. So just FYI, for the record, I am a homebody and I'm a bit of an introvert, quite a bit of an introvert. So I too like to hang out around the house, and I too am a quiet person, and I'm not spending time daily with friends. But even if this husband is on the spectrum, he is going to be capable of having friends. And I think greatly benefits from friendship the same way all of us do, because no one person in our lives can meet all of our emotional and social needs. We need a supporting cast of at least half a dozen to start meeting those needs, if not more. And my experience with those on the spectrum is that they were horribly abused and mocked by other children in elementary school for being big weirdos, and they were made fun of, and they've learned to avoid people because people can be so incredibly cruel. And again, that was a decision they made as children in the face of early childhood trauma. But it's not exactly working for them as adults. And I think as adults, more and more of us over time are aware of the value of neurodiversity and having friends who are different from us. And myself, of all my clients, and I've had many with who presented as being autistic, they're amazing people. They're pretty wonderful. They're kind. They're compassionate. And they have a way of processing information that is so different from me that I have been mentally knocked on the side of the head and had to look at life really differently in a way that I found very valuable. So I know those of us who aren't on the spectrum can be friends with people who are on the spectrum. And I know vice versa from talking to my clients as they start figuring this out. And yes, of course, it would help any marriage for both people to have their own set of friends. And in the spirit of divorce, it also helps avoid a lot of the depression that I experienced, because I really had given up all my friends in an attempt to make the marriage work and to help her feel loved. And so just to know that strategy does not work, and that having friends post-divorce is one way of really ensuring your mental health continues in the face of a real devastating loss.
Yeah, I didn't go through a divorce, but my last breakup, lost some friends, but also reconnected, I think, on a whole new level with the ones that I've had, and made me really appreciate them a lot more.
Yeah, and to nurture those relationships and really, whether it's with time or our treasure or our talent, just helping people we love and care about. I've never found it possible to outgive my friends. My friends are just wonderful giving men, and they really help me become a better man. So I like to see men have a good handful of friends, but one is so much better than none.
Yeah, great. So yeah, he's got to go get a friend then. Just at least one.
Yeah, at least one. And there's a way to do that. And also, I would say romantic relationships, including marriage, they're harder than making friends. So if he's already married and he's been able to do that, yeah, he can do this other thing. And I know that he may not want to, but I think the way for a woman in this situation to present it is to say something like, yeah, but I need you to have friends.
Yeah.
Because I need you to have that experience and those resources in your life with people who can really help you learn to listen in a different way to people who are different. And I also need friends of my own. And I don't like the idea of my having an active social life and you've got nothing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think, but the only reason I think autistic people resist and are reluctant is because of all that childhood trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got to work through it, people.
Toughen up, you big sissies.
All right, well, thanks for the question and thanks for the chat, Steve. Appreciate it.
Sure. Bye now.